when you look at Europe and the expansion of the Latin language under the Roman Empire, and then you look at the expansion of Christianity, which is using Latin as a church language, how far can you extend that comparison with Islam when the ordinary people of Europe began falling away from the Latin language even as Christianity's religion was expanding through, where the Arabic language and the religion became the language of the common people as well as the elite?
Well, yeah, the same thing happened with the Muslims. Because, if we talk about Islam and the West, and we try to look at these two trajectories and the manner in which these two cultures or civilizations were traveling, you will see that in the Islamic world, Arabic spread not only as a liturgical language. Remember, throughout the conquered lands, the Arabs were always a minority. Just like the Europeans when they went to Africa or Asia. And we have 5,000 Englishmen. They were ruling India. 5,000 of them were ruling India. So, the same thing was happening. You will have Arabs who are minorities, and they began to influence these societies. I think the English analogy in India is a good example. Today you have more Indians, 200 million Indians today speak English because of the British influence in India. You have more Indians now speaking English than Englishmen on the British Isles. You see what I'm saying? This is the same thing that happened with Islam, and with greater ease, because when Islam went in there, the Arabs did not maintain distance. They intermarried with these cultures. That's why today you find all over the Muslim world people who claim to be Quraysh descendants, and they call themselves Sharifs. You see what I'm saying? In Africa, they are Haidaras or Sharifs. You find them in South Asia, they call them, say, Sayyids. You go to Southeast Asia, you find them among all those other groups. That shows you the big difference. Whereas the Englishmen, of course, they try to maintain a caste in terms of ruling the Indians. But there were people we call Anglo-Indians. They still exist, because you're going to have some Englishmen who will intermarry with some locals against the wishes of the ruling class. Now, whereas in the case of the Arabs, they were like the Romans. When they went to other areas, they intermarried. And that also facilitated their expansion of their culture. They intermarried with the Persians, they intermarried with the Chinese, and all these other groups wherever they went. So that also helped their languages, and they had slaves. So naturally, it was very easy for Arabic to spread among people who previously were not speaking Arabic. And you found many Persians, out of self-interest, just like out of many Indians, like Nehru and others, out of self-interest, they knew English. So the same thing happened in this particular case. Always the case with civilizations, that when the civilizations move out, they will begin to penetrate these other societies, and if they are dominant, other people will like to imitate them. You can see that Americans do not exercise the classical colonialism in other parts of the world, as the British, the French, the Portuguese did. But today you find all over the world, they're all playing rap music now. They're all dancing rap everywhere in the world. You don't have American colonialists living in those countries. They're playing country music, all American thing. They have all these things all over the place. That is what happened. I think I'm trying to give you so you can try to understand how when Latin came as a colonial language, because Julius Caesar conquered England. And Julius Caesar defeated Vercingetorix, the leader of the French, the Gauls. That's how Latin spread among the Europeans. Arabic also spread by conquest in North Africa and in the Middle East. But Arabic, like Latin, became liturgical languages. So I think that parallel becomes very important. Now, what is the difference between the European experience and the Muslim experience, to answer John further, is the fact that when you look at the case of Europe, the rise of Protestantism would be very much linked to the vernacularization of the scriptures. Because Beatrice of Nazareth was one of the agitators and the establishers of these Beguines groups. And people who were part of this Beguine group, among the Flemish, one of them Marguerite Porete wrote a book of mysticism in Flemish 800 years ago. And that was a revolution, because at that time all the books were in Latin. But here was someone trying to go vernacular, to vernacularize. And you will see that pattern would be established, and from that 13th century exercise, 1233, right through Martin Luther, who decided to translate the Bible into German, you had intermediary points. You have the two Johns, one that is very famous now among Protestants, John Wycliffe, who translated the Bible into English. And then, of course, you have the other John, John Hus, the Bohemian, who translated it into Czech, because he translated Wycliffe's book, the Bible in English, into Czech. But he ended up at the stake because this was considered heretical. And of course, it also led to wars between these dissidents and the Catholic rulers. And you can see that in the Western experience, the vernacularization of the translation of the scriptures into the local languages, something that did not happen, like in the Muslim world. It did not happen. It's a recent phenomenon. Throughout the Islamic history, the Muslims did not want to give any kind of privilege to translations, because translation they felt would be divisive, and translation would also distort the message. That was why they continue to encourage their intellectuals to study Arabic, Fusha Arabic, even not modern Arabic, Fusha Arabic, so that they know the Quranic Arabic and they can read it, they understand it, and they can keep it. And this is what gave rise to a distinct group called the ulama in the history of Islam. And these people became experts in a variety of disciplines. You have parallels in the West. We already know that Latin was the language of the conquering Romans. But the Roman Empire was overtaken by the Vandals, the Goths, and the Visigoths. You know that history. Now, with the collapse of the Roman Empire, of course, Latin found refuge in the church. That's how the Irish saved the world. because the Irish became the priests, and they were the ones who kept that knowledge to a greater degree than the others. You have the Italians, but they were dominated by these Germanic tribes. And you see that even today in Italy, the Italians who are from Lombardy, even though they're Italians, they have Italian names like Borelli. If you talk to them, they say, we're Germans. Oh yes, because they are of Germanic origins, as opposed to the Sicilians and the Florentines and all the other groups. That's history. You see, so you can see that even though Latin came with the conquering Romans and became the liturgical language of Europe through the Catholic Church, but with the rise of these dissident groups, like the Beguines, who later would be renamed Protestants, because you have the Waldens. You remember Peter Waldo from Lyon, who sold his property and then became the leader of the group that came to be known as the Waldens. And the Waldens, of course, would become an important group among the Protestants movement. But the translation of the text into vernacular languages would help expose the Bible to the ordinary people. Now, the parallel order that was going on for the Muslims are the Sufi orders. But the difference between the Western orders, like the Dominicans and the Franciscans, the Sufi orders that emerged among the Muslims were resisted in Persia. In fact, at one point in time, the ruling elites tried to crush these organizations. And you have the well-known Khalaj, Mansur Khalaj, who lost his head as a heretic, just like some of those members of the Beguines in the European context were considered heretical because the way they were preaching or practicing the religion was not in accordance with what the people who controlled the state felt the religion should be. But you will see also in the Iranian experience that the Sufi groups would be politically active to the point that they will bring into existence a ruling dynasty, the Hajar dynasty, will come into power because of the Sufi elements. And you find that in the Ottoman, some of the Sufi orders were considered a threat to the authorities, and the authorities were willing to use the state to crush them. Several times this occurred during the Ottoman period. And if you go to the earlier period, before the collapse of the Abbasid dynasty in 1258, you find that the Sufi orders that were beginning to emerge among the Muslims were considered very much like the hippies in American civilization for a while. But gradually they were able to gain respectability, just like Jerry Rubin became a Wall Street executive. So I mean, like you have this in civilization, groups that were considered marginal, but then gradually they begin to find their way into the mainstream and are legitimized as part of the mainstream. And of course the Sufi orders over time became very much part of the mainstream of Islam because the Islamic State could not cross them, because the Muslims don't have that relationship that exists in the European context. In the European context, because of the power of the Catholic Church, there was this relationship between the church and the ruling family. But there is a difference here when you look at the Muslims and the Muslims and the Christians in Latin Christianity, in the sense that in the case of the Muslims, because the ulama did not constitute itself the way the Catholic priest and the church constitute itself vis-a-vis the ruling authority, the ulama was always at the mercy of the elites, political elites. And that's continued to be the case even today among Muslims. Al-Azhar University, which is the stronghold of orthodoxy in Egypt, is really controlled by the Egyptian government. And most of those imams are appointed by the Egyptian government. But you have dissident groups like the Ikhwan al-Muslimun and all these dissident groups that challenge the authority of the system. But the way these Muslim dissident groups operate in the Muslim world is different from what occurs in Europe. Because in the European experience, those groups like the Beguines and others that I mentioned, and later on they became more evident in the form of various Protestant groups like the Quakers, the Anabaptists, etc. All those other groups that emerged in the European experience, they found themselves caught between the church they were opposed to and the king. And because the king was the arbiter, he controls the state, and was able to enjoy certain privileges by virtue of the doctrine of divine rights of kings. So long as the Catholic Church was able to work out a deal with the king, the equivalent of the Sharia for the Muslims manifested itself in terms of canon law, something that the Protestants will not have at all, because by the time the Protestants begin to challenge the authorities, that idea of canon law, which exercised a great deal of influence in the daily lives of people, was being gradually challenged by secular law from the king. And this is the difference. This is one of the reasons why when you hear, oh, Muslims, they don't have separation of church and state. It's because of the political evolution of Muslim society as opposed to the political evolution of Western society. Because in the political evolution of Western society, as the church began to lose political power vis-a-vis the king, remember, the king could be excommunicated. But when Henry VIII decided to break away, that made it categorically clear that power lies in the hands of the king, not in the pope. And that would become more evident in the 16th century when Martin Luther nailed his 95 theses on the wall of that church in Gothenburg. That was a major transformation. So when we now talk about Islam and the West, we must have in our mind these two trajectories. What was happening in the Latin Christian world as it evolved, and what is happening in the Middle East Islamic world. And things would change for the Muslims after they lost the caliphate in 1258. Because what happened then is the Muslims now found themselves in a situation whereby there are many governments that were headed by people who called themselves consciously as Muslims. But that titular head called the Caliph, that was the unifying umbrella, was no longer there. Because the Fatimites would claim the caliphate in Egypt, and they were Shiites. And then, of course, you have some other people who were survivors of the Mughal onslaught, claiming to be the caliphate. And of course, then, because the Umayyads were overthrown much earlier by the Abbasid, in Spain, the descendants of the Umayyad were also claiming to be the caliphate. So you have these three different centers of power. By the way, the same thing happened with the Christians, in the sense that once the Vandals destroyed the Roman Empire and the capital moved to Istanbul, what we call Istanbul today, or Constantinople, you have different popes. You have the Latin popes, and then you have the Greek-speaking pope. It still exists today, because the Eastern Christians, they still have their popes. Of course, Pope John Paul, before he passed away, tried to reconcile the East and the Western branches of the church, hoping to bring them together. But you do have separate papacies. Of course, the most prominent and most widely known is the Roman Catholic Pope. The Muslims, of course, since 1258, found themselves with people who claimed to be caliphs, but they did not enjoy the moral authority or the political power of the original caliphs. And that continued in diminishing order until 1914 through 18, World War I, when the Ottomans were defeated, and in 1924, Ataturk abolished the institution altogether. So even that figurehead that was maintained since 1258 became non-existent at all. It was completely just wiped out. So since that abolition of the caliphate, there were caliphate movements in India and what is now called Pakistan, tried to push for the restoration of the caliphate during that particular period. But the movement never materialized because the Turks under Ataturk decided not to go that way. But there are still people who have this idea of creating a unified Islam with a caliphate. And of course, in America, we have some young Muslims who used to talk about California. Because California, so I mean, but the thing is, when you really talk about Islam and the West, therefore, you have to bear in mind these two different trajectories. And I try to make this very clear so you can see what was happening in Europe and what was happening in the Middle East and the Muslim world. Now, it is against this background that we can really understand what is going on now between the Muslim world and the so-called Western world. Because the Latin Christians, meaning the Europeans, before the Reformation, and after the Reformation, of course, you have two Christian blocks, the Catholics and the Protestants. And they were juggling it out. They were fighting it out, just like the whole of Christendom was fighting against the Muslims. What has happened really is the battle that was going on between Latin Christians against the Muslims was now going inside Europe between the Catholics and the Protestants. So what was an external fight became an internal fight in Europe. And the Treaty of Westphalia solved that problem. In the 17th century, after all these fights, almost 130 years, 31 years, after Luther came in the 1517. So if you add 113 years, almost around that time, you get the Treaty of Westphalia. Westphalia was a turning point. Because you see, Westphalia would set the stage for what led to the state of affairs we now have today in the world. And you cannot understand the relationship between the Muslims and the Christians and the people called the West today unless you understand these historical forces and how they shape world affairs and world consciousness. Up until Westphalia, Protestants and Catholics were fighting one another as if they did not belong to the same fold, because each one thought that he has the truth and the other one is a heretic and must be burned at the stake. At Westphalia, the princes decided that they are not going to allow fighting anymore. So the princes work out a deal among themselves. It works for them, because this way they undermine the power of the church. And it also undermines canon law. That's the root cause of the difference. Up until that period, the Christians were very much like the Muslims. They were governed by canon law. Just like the Jews were governed by the halakha. But with Westphalia, things change. With Westphalia now, the Protestants don't have to go by the canon law anymore. That's why the Protestants never developed a thoroughgoing philosophy, legal philosophy about law, the way the Muslims or the Jews or the Catholics have done historically. So as a result of Westphalia now, you have a new day. The religion of the king is the religion of the state. Remember that? Yes, please.
You had to live in a certain area.
Huh?
You had to live in a certain area. You were told, like, if you're going to be a Protestant, you had to live in the northern section. If you're going to be a Catholic, you had to live in the
Exactly. Because the religion of the king or the prince is the religion of the state. That was.
If you didn't like what your prince had decided, you had to move.
That is correct. Because that is why we still see remnants of that today. If you go to Germany, the northern Germans are what? Lutherans. The southern Germans are what? Catholics. It goes to Westphalia. You see, Westphalia. And you found, that was one of the reasons why, if you are a Protestant and you live in France, like the Huguenots, you better go elsewhere. That's why the Huguenots came to America. That's why they came here. And the last names of the Huguenots are still with many Americans. If you know the history, you look at the telephone books, you can see their names. They have melted. Yes, please.
I like this idea too of this external war with the Muslims turning into the internal war of Protestant Catholic Europe. But it's interesting, I think, too, to add to that the idea of Spain itself, which begins with an internal war against the Muslims.
Exactly. You see, this is one of the reasons why it's not fair when we talk about Islam and the West, and we assume as if you have this long history of people just fighting one another on the basis of you are Muslim, we are Christian. No, the Muslims were fighting among themselves. The Christians were fighting among themselves. And Sometimes they make deals and alliances. So some of the things that were happening in the Middle Ages and in the post-Middle Ages, right up to the modern period, are recurrent themes. Now, but the point you make is very clear. That's true. What happened is, in Spain, the Muslims were able to maintain themselves, but they were gradually losing power in Spain. And that's one of the reasons why, if you look at the demographics of the Iberian Peninsula, you have some very interesting mix there. Because while the Christians were waging, Pope Urban II was the one in the 11th century who instigated the First Crusade. You remember that? Richard the Lionheart would be captured and he had to be ransomed from Saladin, 1099. Now, Spain comes into this. Many of those Europeans who were bound for the Holy Land, especially those who came from England, they came by way of Portugal. That's one of the reasons why you find in Portugal many Portuguese of English descent. Remember the so-called Prince Henry the Navigator, John of Gaunt, remember? Because that was the connection between the Portuguese ruling family and the English. Of course, the Spaniards were also connected to the English because of marriage of dynasties. Now, the point I want to make here is that in Spain, because the southern part of Spain was still Muslim, and the northern part was being gradually reconquered, reconquistadores, before the conquistadores came to Mexico here, New Mexico here. The reconquistadores that were gradually pushing the Muslims south from the northern part of Spain, and they were taking those Muslim kingdoms that were conquered from the Spaniards much earlier, since the 711, with Tariq ibn Ziyad. From the time of the First Crusade right up to 1492, when Granada fell, we see the gradual erosion of Muslim presence in the Iberian Peninsula. This loss of Spain, which effectively removed Muslims from Europe, except for Eastern Europe, because Muslims through the Turks, once the Turks, remember, the Turks conquered the eastern wing of Christianity after 1492. When Usman, the Ottoman, established the Ottoman dynasty, it's named after him, Usman. Mehmed and the great-grandson, Suleiman the Magnificent, would extend the frontiers of the Ottoman into Europe. That's one of the reasons why today 14 of the members of the EU were at one point in time partially or totally ruled by Muslims. 14 of the EU countries today, European Union. Over the last 500 years, they were governed by Muslims. And of course today, if you go to Europe, the only places where you have Muslim majority and some Muslim political presence is Bosnia and where? Huh? Kosovo, yes, and Albania, yes, you are right, all three. Those are the remnants. But Bulgaria used to be dominated by the Muslims. The Muslims were ruling southern France. The Muslims were ruling Portugal. The Muslims were ruling part of Italy. You see what I'm saying? The Muslims were ruling Greece until the British freedom from Ottoman rule. And you find the Muslim presence in Hungary. You see, so all of those countries in the East, that was after 1492. But one thing that scholars are now beginning to realize in looking at Islam and the West, and people like Richard Bulliard is one guy who is working along this line among some of the other scholars who are beginning to focus on this, is that when you look at Islam and its interaction with the West, what you have to remember is that 1492 is a major watershed that will now, people like Bullitt will use Islam and the West, Latin West, as fraternal twins that went their separate ways. And I think 1492 is an important benchmark because 1492 led to the defeat of the Muslims in Granada and the effective removal of Muslims out of Spain, removal of the Jews out of Spain. Because one of the myths that is now, because of the Arab-Israeli conflict now, there is a revisionist history that is being written by both Muslims and Jews. But really, up until 1492 and up until 1948, the Jews were the Scotsmen of the Arabs. Let me give you the analogy. If you look at the rise of the British Empire, wherever you have an Englishman, he has a quarterback. In his, if you use the American metaphor, you have a Scotsman. The Scottish were always the partners of the English, wherever the English went to govern. They were the administrators in India. Most of the administrators in India and in Africa and the Caribbean were Scotsmen. See, the Jews were like that with the Arabs. They were cousins. Today, if you tell people, they don't want to hear that. On both sides of the fence. They forgot that history. And in Spain, at the height of Muslim power in Spain, when Europeans come to study in Spain, in Toledo, in Granada, Cordova, it was more difficult for the European students, Gregory of Cremona, Roger Williams, all of those guys who came to study from Europe in Spain. They would have to hire a Jew who knows Arabic. And he's the go-between them and a Spaniard who knows Latin. Because the educated German or the educated Englishman or the educated Burgundian, they are not as they are now, they are different kingdoms. All those people who came to study would find themselves gaining this new knowledge, which was the inheritance of the Greeks, preserved in Arabic, translated to them by the Jewish scholar, and then the Spanish will get it from the Jew in Spanish and then give it to them in Latin. That's how they got it. And that's one of the reasons why, there are a lot of books about this. You read some of the books by people like Ada Bosserman, like the international cultural relations of that period. This is the way it was. And so, but you see, the creation of the State of Israel and the tension that is going on now has forced people to rewrite history. And you have now new narratives that are written by both the Arabs and some of the Muslims, and then you also have on the Jewish side, they're writing, because of Zionism and because of Arab nationalism, they're revising history. But all you get to do is just go and get the old texts and show it to them. They can see books that were written by Jews and Arabs at that time, and you just present it to them, they look at it, they can see that they engage in revisionism. But the same thing happened in Russia after communism. You begin to revise according to communist lines. You revise the text based on communism, because you're a Marxist. So you write history from a Marxist point of view. And you play this sleight of hand, because that's what scholars can be magicians too. They can play with this sleight of hand in terms of rewriting. So you develop a master narrative which gradually just surf on the sidelines things that were central. And this is precisely what happened. So when you look at the relationship between the Islamic world and the Western world, what you have to recognize is that the founding of the Americas by Columbus was a major turning point in world history. The last 500 years redefined the relationship between the Western people and the rest of the world. But it defined the relationship between the Western people we call the Westerners now, and the Muslim world. And it also redefined the relationship within this geographic zone itself. How? When Columbus set sail for the New World, simultaneously, Jews and Muslims were being kicked out of Spain. One of the great ironies I always tell my students is that the ship of sorrow, that was the name of the ship that was taking the Jews out of Spain. The ship of sorrow, kicking the Muslims and the Jews. Most of them landed in North Africa. Some of the Jews went to Holland. That's why Holland has been the most liberal place among the European countries. They ended up in Holland, many of the Jews. People like Spinoza, the philosopher, they grew out of that place. Many of those Jews, they ended up in the Ottoman, Salamanca. They went to the Ottomans. Many of them settled in Morocco. That's why you still have a large number of Jews still in Morocco, even after the creation of Israel. Some of them went to Tunisia. Now, what does this mean? 1492, for Islam in its relationship with the West, and for the West in its relationship with Islam, and what happened to Muslims in their own context, and what happened to the Latin Christians in their own context. The discovery of America changed the whole ballgame. Because when America was discovered, the Europeans, who were becoming increasingly overcrowded, remember you had the Black Death in the middle period, which almost wiped a large number of the European people. But by the time Columbus set sail for the New World, the population of Europe has increased. So you are beginning to have overcrowding in some places. And as a result of that discovery, the Spaniards were able to find new avenues for their people. With the end of the Crusades, you can't send them to the Middle East. That's one of the reasons why if you look at the Arabs, you will find the differences in pigmentation among them, which is likely because of the Crusades. If you draw a line along the Mediterranean where you have the Arabs, you find that those Arabs who look more European, you will find them on the coast of the Mediterranean, now called Lebanon. You have Tyre, you have Jaffa, you have Haifa, you have Beirut, and you come down. Those Arabs, they look like Europeans because they are the descendants of the Crusaders who stay behind. And that's one of the reasons why in the Lebanese civil war, some of those Lebanese Christians, they wanted to create their own Christian state. They still want to create a Christian state. This is what was happening at the time. Now, when Columbus moved out of Spain, the Spaniards were now able to accomplish a major achievement because they were now able to have access to gold, which was controlled by the Muslims. Because at the height of Muslim dominance, Europeans could not get spices without going through Muslims. They couldn't get silk without getting to Muslims. Remember Marco Polo, the Italian? He had to pass through Muslim lands and Mughal lands to go into China. So, because the Muslims controlled the gold mines, they controlled the silk trade, the ivory trade, the spice trade, with the exploration of the New World by Columbus, the Europeans were now able to find new lands. That's why they call the native people here Indians, because he thought he was going to India. Why? Because the Portuguese, who were the rivals of the Spaniards, and the Pope himself divided the world into two spheres. Today we forget it. We forgot that the two dominant countries in Europe were the Portuguese and the Spaniards. And with the backing of the Pope, before the Protestant Revolution, the world was split into two camps by a papal bull. That's why Brazil is in the Portuguese camp, because of their latitude and longitude. The Pope gave Brazil to the Portuguese and the Azores, and anything west was Spaniard. Right? Then came the Reformation and the challenge to the church with Henry VIII and the Armada. These are major developments in the European context, because the Spaniards will gradually lose power to the British and the Dutch and the French. And that's one of the reasons why you can see the division in the continent here. The northern part of America is controlled by whom? The English-speaking and the French-speaking. They took it from the Spaniards. We're right here in New Mexico. This was the last stronghold for the Spaniards. That's one of the reasons why some of the Latino scholars in America now, they're using the metaphor that was used in Spain, convivencia. They say, in America now, if you live in New Mexico, in Arizona, in Texas, you now have convivencia, which was the term used to describe the coexistence of the Muslims. The coexistence of the Muslims and the Christians in Spain. Convivencia. Con, C-O-N, mean with, vivencia. Yeah. E-E-ensa. S-A, right? Z-A, Z-A. C-A, C. Yeah, okay, convivencia. Yes, please. N. Okay.
I wanted to ask you, I read in some place in an article the idea that when there've been an old world conflict, we were talking about the Muslim world in the West. That old world conflict in places like Eastern Europe and in Spain, with the breaking out of the Spanish to the New World and all the way to Asia, to Southeast Asia, that this turned into really the first global conflict. Is it fair to say that?
Yeah.
The encountering of the Muslim world with the Spanish and
Both the Portuguese, actually both the Portuguese and the Chinese and the Spaniards saw themselves locked in a fight, which was the extension of the Iberian fight. They defeated the Muslims on the Iberian Peninsula. They want to defeat them globally. That's why the Spaniards were the first one to encounter the Muslim in Philippines. That's why you have the Moro. They call them Moro. Moors. You see, the Moros, the Moors. That's how they know those people in southern part of Philippines.
So can you talk about a world war in that context, maybe the first one?
Huh?
Can you talk about a global war or a global conflict?
Well, I mean, like one would say that with the end of the Crusades and the discovery of the Americas, what was an Iberian phenomena was being globalized by these rising powers, the Portuguese and the Spaniards. So these two powers now were trying to create a world order of their own. But again, you come back to the tension between the Catholics and the Protestants, because the Armada would give rise to the British Empire, which is English-speaking, not Spanish-speaking, which is Protestant. Remember Elizabeth, Sir Walter Raleigh, Francis Drake and all those people. This would be, and of course, with the defeat of the Spaniards by the English and the rise of the Dutch, the French, the Danes, and the British, you now begin to find rivalry among those European powers. And they no longer define themselves in terms of religion, really. They now define themselves in terms of secular power. And I would argue that the founding of the Americas and the establishment of the American Republic would change the whole scene for the European Christians and the Muslim world. Because what happened now is the Muslims have lost their monopoly of access to all those resources. Because with Bartholomew Dias and Vasco da Gama circumnavigating the Cape of Good Hope, Europeans now have access not only to the Americas, but they can go directly to Spain. You see what I'm saying? So from 1492, even earlier, because Bartholomew Dias circumnavigated the Cape of Good Hope before Columbus came to the New World here. So the Portuguese and the Spaniards were now able to travel around the world and create global trading centers in all parts of the world where their caravels, their ships, could go. And this would change the course of world history. That's why the last 500 years has been a major challenge to the Muslims with regard to power. Because you see the gradual loss of power by the Muslims. They didn't lose power completely, but as a result of the discovery of the Americas and the circumnavigation of the Cape of Good Hope, Europeans were now able to reach lands where Muslims enjoy hegemony and monopoly. Because up until the Portuguese came to the Indian Ocean, that was dominated by the Muslims. Up until the Portuguese circumnavigated the Cape of Good Hope, the Red Sea was Muslim territory. And the Pacific was unknown to the Europeans. And the Muslims were able to go to China, and they were able to go to Indonesia and Malaysia. That's how all those places became Muslim. Now, when the Europeans came into the region, they were now getting access to the resources in this area. They were beginning to establish trading centers, and this would change the whole situation. Now Muslims were encountering a different kind of European. They're not encountering the European as a crusader, a true believer, a Christian soldier coming into the Muslim lands. Now they're encountering them as traders, explorers, and naval people who are coming in.